This is the High Desert Luthiery podcast with luthier Julia Felix.
I think eventually I'll have a good handle on what everything means so that I can just kind of like whip out exactly what people want. If they say like, I need this kind of sound, I can say, oh, I know from like my experiences making all these things that, if I put this arch shape with this kind of wood and like on this type of model, I can get something like that.
Joining me for today's show is luthier Julia Felix of Felix Violins. I had a great chat with her. She shared about her ideas around burnout. We talked about something that's sort of near and dear to me right now, which is kind of, working full time in your shop, or do you spread the load and, take on some part-time work, maybe some other gigs. It's a topic that came up with many builders, and we did a blog about it. And, there's so many different walks of life attracted to luthierie, and I love sharing about the people side of things. What do you do for work comes up in just everyday conversation when you meet somebody new. And, as luthiers, we definitely do luthier work, but sometimes we've got other gigs going on. And I was very happy that Julia was happy to share about that. We talked about sort of the world of violins, which is totally foreign to me, and the sort of rules, the set of rules that come with that. We talked about a bunch of other stuff. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All right, welcome to the High Desert Luthiery podcast. I'm Perry from Unga Guitars and the creator of the High Desert Luthiery Invitational, or HDLI for short. The HDLI is a small trade show that Allison and I put on twice a year, June and December. This is a celebration of luthiers, luthier-adjacent creators, musicians, and the art that comes from combining these things. The HDLI supports the music community by providing free booths to the vendors and free admission to the public. All of the participating vendors and musicians are curated by me to create a cohesive, organized event. HDLI encourages community and collaboration amongst the artists. This podcast is one way to help us all get to know one another. To learn more about the show and the artists, please visit our website, highdesertluthiery.com, to listen to more episodes of the podcast. You can visit our YouTube channel, High Desert Luthiery Podcast. You can also catch us on Instagram, and we appreciate you hitting all the good buttons, showing us as much love as possible. Joining me today is Julia Felix of Felix Violins. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You mentioned Women in Luthiery. What is that?
Women in Luthierie, it's mostly a Facebook group that was created a few years ago to help other women luthiers kind of connect with each other. It was started by Jimin Kim and Jennifer Kredick. They're the co-founders. And they basically just, used to like to meet up for coffee and chats and stuff. And they wanted to kind of include everyone. So they made a Facebook group so that we could do that kind of like over Zoom a lot. I use Zoom a lot. So, yeah, that's kind of what it's for. It's for facilitating that kind of stuff and for giving us like a safe space to talk about things. And then, there's an Instagram page for it that's open to everybody to just kind of check out what's going on, usually featuring guitar makers and, cello makers, violin makers, all kinds of people. So, yeah.
That's very cool. I haven't heard of that. I'll have to check that out. Man, we were working really hard to find woman luthiers, female luthiers. And I realized that some of the amp companies I was aware of were primarily, were like female owned run companies. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that. And then I found a handful of amp makers. There's one in Colorado. Of course, no one got back to me yet. So I'm, I'm still waiting, like fingers crossed we can make this happen, because it's such a male dominated industry. It's just kind of annoying because I feel like the industry as a whole, if you get around to, well, even if you look at the publications, it can lean towards being toxic and masculine. And I feel like I kind of have this want for balance. and a voice. And I feel like when it's a male dominated thing, it takes a lot for even a female who is into the same thing to want to get involved more. So just to have like one is great. The last show we had a couple of female luthiers join us, and I feel like it was enough to balance things out. So I was like really excited that you wanted to be a part of the show. So thank you for that, and we're happy to support you in any way that we can. Where are you from?
Santa Fe, New Mexico. Yeah, my parents met here in the 70s. My dad is originally just from here, and my mom had moved over from California, and they got married. They moved back to California for a little bit, but we moved back when I was, I think, 8 or something. So I've been here for a good chunk of time, and I just kind of consider myself from here. I have a lot of family here, things like that. So, yeah.
What part of California were you guys living in?
My mom was like living in kind of like Redondo Beach area. It's like a little bit south of LA. And so we lived in Hermosa Beach, which is right next to it.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, I had like a little mini beach life when I was a kid. Had really blonde hair because I was in the sun so much, and it was really tan. And then we moved here.
Right on. Right
Yeah.
on. I'm from California. Allison and I both moved here almost 6 years ago now.
Oh, cool.
And I'm from up further north, Monterey Bay Area. And I enjoy the area. I think I enjoy it more that I don't live there. But I guess that's how it goes. What sort of things do you make?
I make violins and violas right now. I might, feel brave and try a cello someday. We'll see. Um, but I generally do either Stradivari models or Guarneri models for violins. And for violas, I've actually just been doing Gasparo da Salo models so far. He's another kind of older maker from Italy. I don't know how much you know about violin making.
I don't
Yeah,
know shit.
yeah.
Okay. Um,
Like with guitars, people, I think you guys maybe copy things a little bit. I'm not sure.
yes.
Okay.
And I just want to lead with this, and like I'm not afraid to be myself, so I'll just say, like, my experience around a lot of violin makers, and I've had some really good experiences, but like, you can't throw a rock without hitting a guitar maker. And I know absolutely nothing about violins other than if somebody brings one to my shop, it's just like uh, problem solving, right? I'm a woodworker, I'm a luthier, I can most likely figure it out, and usually I have. But I don't know the first thing about them. So when you talk about models, and maybe I should also add this, the vast majority of our audience listening are probably guitar oriented, right? And so some of them might know some violin makers or be familiar, but probably not as many. And then I'll ask you questions. Don't worry about trying to be like super thorough and all that stuff. I'll ask you questions if I feel it's necessary and if I remember to. But can you describe the models of a violin that you mentioned? Like give examples of maybe where we might have seen them or where that image is most popular.
Hmm. Um, that's a little tricky, I think, because I think people who don't work on violins a lot tend to just kind of see them all as looking kind of the same. You know, and you do see a lot of Stradivari models. Stradivari was, a very well-known Italian maker from the Renaissance kind of period. And a lot of instruments are just kind of based off of that style. It's probably easier to think of them generally as styles, I guess, than like specific models, because a lot of times that's what's happening. Like factory instruments that you see, they just kind of have like vaguely Stradivari type shapes, and that's about it. So that's probably the most common thing you see because they're very nicely made. That's part of what has helped them last so long. He was a very good maker in his time. A lot of very wealthy people commissioned instruments from him and then kept them in good shape for a very long time. So they're still around. And so, we have this kind of standard idea of what things should look like, a lot of times based off of that. And Guarneris are kind of like, I would say, maybe the next most popular. And when I say Guarneri, it's Del Jesu, like Joseph Guarneri del Jesu. And those are really different even from each other. They're clearly made like in a similar kind of a style, but he was a much more, I don't know how to describe that, maybe kind of, I don't want to say sporadic, but he just didn't have like, you can tell when you look at his work that it's a little more, he just kind of like went for it. Like
Maybe less disciplined.
I mean, the work it's consistent in a sense. So it doesn't seem like he's, doesn't know what he's doing. It's just kind of like, I'm going to carve out these F holes. They look like this now. I'm going to call it done. Instead of like stratigraphies, like clearly, somebody spent a good amount of time making those exactly so. And you don't really get that impression from a lot of the Del Jesus. But the thing with Del Jesus is they also sound very good in their own way. They're a little different, but they are also very nice instruments that have lasted a long time. So those tend to be like the two main types of violins that people will copy because, a lot of famous players have those, I guess, is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I've noticed that there seems to be a real sort of tight idea of what is acceptable in the mainstream violin scene. A lot of violin makers I'm aware of are still doing like 100% of the work by hand. I just find that so romantic. And it's a place where I want to be with guitars. And I feel like, having the bigger instrument, some of the things like tuning pegs, for instance, it's not very reasonable to make violin style tuning pegs for a guitar. It's just not. So like I was just talking with Greg from Skyscraper Guitars up in Colorado earlier this morning, and he was talking about possibly getting into making tuning machines, and I was like, whoa. It's something I've been into for a long time, but it's a big part of what I appreciate about violins and bowed instruments is you can pretty much make the whole damn thing. I mean, if you wanted to, you can make the strings. Like if you wanted to, if you had a few extra cats around, or you could make the strings. And so like and I probably have a few cats if you're interested in that sort of thing. They're very bad right now. If we're lucky, if we're lucky, they'll make an appearance. They're short-haired domestic terrorists.
The process of making gut strings can be like pretty disgusting in the beginning, kind of like how tanning leather can be. So I don't think it's the sort of thing most people want to do.
Yeah, I am sure that it is. I worked as a butcher for a little while and raised and butchered some of my own animals, and I would imagine that process is pretty gross. We haven't started tanning hides or anything like that, but that's in the works. And I'm sure there's some people out here that would, gladly do it for you, especially out here in New Mexico. I bet you there's some folks that do that. Why the violin for you?
I think a lot of it had to do with what you said, that it's mostly handwork. I actually was a classical guitar player and I loved playing, but I found out I still have pretty bad stage fright. I thought I was past it, and then I tried to play in front of some people and I was like, oh no, this isn't working. Like my hands just start shaking and I can't do it. So I knew that, a career doing that wasn't really going to happen. But, my hands were still very important to me, and machines like freak me out a little bit, using all these machines where you can just so easily chop off your fingers. And so it appealed to me a lot that violins were almost all handwork. It's pretty hard to plane your finger off. You can You can like cut yourself, like, like we've got like these knives are actually mostly what we use for a lot of different things. And you can kind of cut yourself pretty bad if you're not careful, but I've never cut myself that badly. I just liked the idea of doing as much stuff with my hands as possible, basically. And I also liked that, I feel like it's really appreciated that they're made by hand, like with like I love guitars, like as much as I love guitars, I feel like, you know, people get really excited about factory instruments with guitars still. And, you made like this really nice thing by hand and somebody's still like, "Ooh, look at this thing from this factory." And you're like, "Oh, okay." Like so it's nice to feel a little bit more appreciation, I think. I don't know if it ultimately feels that way on your side of things, but that was something I was trying to avoid because I'd had a lot of jobs in my life at that point that I just felt like people weren't letting me put as much effort in as I wanted to, and they didn't appreciate it when I did put as much effort in as I wanted to. So I wanted to be doing something where that mattered.
I think that's really important to a lot of us these days, especially when most people are working multiple jobs to achieve whatever goal they want to achieve. Another thing to touch on a couple things you reminded me of. Another reason why we put this show together, or maybe something we noticed last year, there was a different show here in Albuquerque, the New Mexico Guitar Show, and Allison and I put up a booth, and I was the only builder there. There was like another, like I teach guitar making, so there was another teacher there with the booth. And then there was a bunch of like out of town vendors and collectors, and it was kind of just like a smorgasbord of like guitar stuff. And I noticed for the first time that there were a large amount of people that didn't understand that this could be done by somebody at home. Like you could, if you wanted to, you could go the long way and not use any power tools. I'm aware of people that do that. And I know a guy up in Santa Fe that does that. And so like that's still a thing. But by and large, they're like, "You made these? Like, where did you get the necks?" "Oh, I made them." Like, "Where did you get this?" "Oh, I made that," oh wow, just kind of scratching their head like, and it's like that for everything, even for violins, because the consumer market doesn't really point people in the direction of artisans or like even appreciating artisans. Like one thing that I've noticed in the guitar community is that people often lead with judgment instead of like excitement. So like, well, why did you do it like this? This doesn't look like a real guitar. Like, isn't it supposed to be buried in plastic paint? Like, and nowadays, like I've gone back and forth, and I think I'm just coming from a different place. I used to say, well, I'm not that company. If you want that, then you go to that company, and I take it personally. And then I turn to saying, well, I didn't make it for you. And I was coming from like the place of like flipping the bird and, like, get out of here. You're bothering me. And nowadays I just come from this kind of place where I'm just willing to joke with people first, whether they know me or not. I'm like, I didn't make it for you. What do you want me to say? Like that's pretty hilarious to me. But like I think after that there is that question of like, do you go around thinking everything is made for you? And I mean it's quite possible. A lot of what's a good word? Well, a lot of social media and cultural trans behavior kind of points people in this position or to this behavior of narcissism and being very self-centered. So it's not surprising. I just remind myself and try not to take it so personally anymore. Do you run into things like that with or is it more of like, man, this is amazing. You did this all by hand. Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I get the same thing a lot where people are just like, "Wait, you make them?" And it's like so far beyond their comprehension that like maybe there's people out there actually making each of these things by hand. I feel like it kind of maybe falls into the same category as like, you know how you see things where people are, starting like these classes and things for kids who grow up in the city who have like no sense of like where actual food comes from. They have to like show them like a farm and like this is how you plant seeds and this is like the food grows and you take it out of the ground and the kids are like mind blown. I think some of it's just like that. Like you're so used to just having these things accessible in large quantities, you stop thinking about where it came from. And, and there are factories, around the world where they're cranking out hundreds of thousands of violins a year, that weren't made to really do much more than just kind of make some noises. And then like, you go buy a different violin in 3 months or give up. And, and so, a lot of times I end up having to, kind of just be like, yeah, I make them like, from like pieces of wood. I have to describe like the little wedges of wood that we use and making book joints and, cutting it out. A lot of people are really surprised that the sides are bent and the top is carved. They usually seem to think it's the other way around. So that's kind of fun. I did see a really terrible medieval style instrument that somebody made that way, and I see why they don't do that. I think they were testing how it was made, and so they carved it out, and it was like really bad.
Yeah, how did you get the wood out of the inside?
Yeah. Yeah, that throws people off a lot too, because I have so like one of the styles of making is you do it on a mold. And so, I bend the ribs, I glue blocks to the mold and then I bend the ribs and glue them to the blocks, and that kind of holds everything in place. And so, yeah, people are like, if I show them the whole rib structure still on the mold, they'll be like, how do you get that part out once it's all put together? And I'm like, oh, I do that in advance. Like, take that out first, and then I put everything together.
I mean, I suppose it comes down to just to how small it is, but it's also the technique that you're using, that the whole frame, the rib structure is fairly rigid. Whereas in a guitar, a lot of times it's very wobbly, and it's probably just the size of it. So most of the time we're completing the acoustic, guitar body in the mold and then removing the mold. It blows my mind. I was just sort of looking into making some more molds for some different body styles that I want to make for this next show that we're doing in June. And I was studying different methods and thinking like, oh, well, I think I want to try some spool clamps to save room. Spool clamps are fairly easy to make. I could just have a box and have, enough for 2 or 3 guitars to glue them all up at once. And so I came across a bunch of different ideas, and was led back into violins and cellos and violas and stuff like that. I was like, oh man, this is really interesting. I wonder how I could apply some of these concepts. But I was just looking at that going, how the fuck does that work? Like, I'm only used to this. Like, and I worked in a production shop for many years doing acoustic guitars. So like I sort of have that understanding of things where I want to be efficient and be able to do many things at once. And I don't have the space to stretch out. So I have to be clever with how I do things. And that brings me to this next thing. Violins are very small and they don't necessarily take up a whole lot of room. It looks like you're sitting at a workbench. Is that where you do a lot of your work?
Yeah, this is my workbench. This is actually the best room for this sort of thing in the house, luckily. So it's actually the smallest room in the house. It was like the most useless room in the house. So it became my workbench room. Yeah, when I was at school, there were, I think, 13 of us in a fairly sizable room, but we all had basically a bench that was about this size and a chunk of the wall right next to it that was about the same like length of the bench, you know. So that was all the space we generally had to work with. We might be able to like fit a little shelf kind of next to like between the two benches or something, but that was about it. So I got really used to putting all my stuff in like a little tiny area and figuring out how to maximize my space and keep things organized kind of. So yeah, I figured I could do it. This bench takes up a lot of space, but it's worth it because it's just so much better than my old workbench.
And what school was this?
This was North Bennet Street School. It's in Boston, Massachusetts. And they do actually a bunch of things there. I think it's the oldest trade school in the country. They have a really prestigious cabinet and furniture making program, actually. And they're one of the only places now that has piano technologies. And violin making is also pretty niche, and that's there. And they have, you know, bookbinding, locksmithing, a bunch of other things. It's a really cool place. And it was really nice to actually go to school in that environment because sometimes you find out about like cool tools from one of the other programs that like carried over into something you could use for your stuff. So that was kind of nice.
What are some of those tools that you might have carried over?
I mean, there are like a few things here and there, but I think actually, I don't know if I have it. Let me see. Let's see. It might just be in this drawer. Yep. So this thing is my favorite thing that I found out about. This was actually the jewelry making program had this like weird little clampy thing for like holding rings. And so you can just like hold it in this end, and then it's got this little wedge that presses it together. And so you can like file stuff without having to like hold it in your fingers.
Oh,
And it's really nice for like nuts and saddles and like little things like that that are kind of a pain to hold on to. I think that was probably like the coolest thing that I found out about there. But I know one of the guys made a purfling pick out of some stuff that he kind of found out. It's like a type of metal that he found out about from the jewelry department. And my cradle has leather on it that I got from the bookbinders. Like
that's
so
cool.
yeah, it's really cool. There's all kinds of good stuff that we got from there. Yeah. So
Early on, I was doing a lot of repairs and I didn't really have a whole lot of tools. And so figuring out a way, nuts and saddles are a lot of the work with guitars too, especially in repair work, replacing them. And it's like, how do I hold this? How do I shape this without sanding my fingers off? Because I'm using mostly power tools for, little belt sanders, little disc sanders, and little band saws. And then shaping everything, I was like, well, let's try a file. I could probably work this down with the file, but how do I hold it? And finding like a little small vise was like the most helpful thing, which is essentially what you have there. That's super cool. I love seeing these ingenious creations that people come up with, to solve a problem. It's such a cool part of what we do, all the cool little things we figure out to help us out. Do you have any more cool little tools like that?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. If I do, they're like hiding around and I'll think of it later when I'm like, oh darn, I should have showed him that thing. I do remember like a couple of years ago, there was a girl on Instagram that I started following because she was violin making. Like she wanted to learn how to make violins. She didn't have the ability, I guess, at the time to go to school or anything, but she just really wanted to do it. And so she was just kind of like going for it. I think she had a book or some YouTube videos or something, and she was just kind of like slowly putting it together. And she didn't have most of the right tools. So she was just coming up with like kind of like impressively creative ways to like glue things together and like clamp stuff. And I really enjoyed following her on Instagram because I'd just be like, wow, like that is like I would never have thought to clamp that like that. Like if, she'd like, it was like a MacGyver level kind of stuff. Like she
Oh
was
yeah.
doing. And yeah, and it was so interesting. And she's since gone to school and, she's graduating this year actually. And, so now she has all the right stuff, but it was just really fun to see somebody like having to figure that out and to kind of think about how people figured all this stuff out in the first place, putting all this together, all these curved shapes, especially, like probably a lot of counterforms and all kinds of crazy ways to clamp things.
Oh, yeah, right. In a world without clamps.
Yeah. It's got your apprentice like holding something.
I hold this for the rest of the day.
Yeah. It's your job. This is strengthening exercise.
Yeah, one of my old coworkers was telling me, like, so, with your glue technique, we're not carpenters, all right? We don't need to drown the whole thing in wood glue and then just clamp it as hard as we can. Like, if anything, it should be a skin layer of glue. You want to see through, you don't want a whole lot of squeeze out. A little bit of squeeze out's okay, so you know there's glue in there. And then you want finger tight. So you want your joinery so good that you could just push it together with your fingers. Okay? So go ahead and push it together. And I pushed it together and he goes, all right, I'll be back in about 2 hours. You make sure to hold that there. And he was joking, of course, but I thought that was a great lesson in like a more efficient way of gluing things and a better understand of how to use clamps, because the tendency for people is just to crank them down. And in carpentry, a lot of times they're just using the table saw as the joiner. And so that's why.
Yeah.
I was just learning, and I'm still learning a lot about that stuff because I never was really into carpentry or anything like that. It was just guitars. And so like I work down here at Albuquerque Exotic Woods, and we make a lot of tables and shelves and stuff, mantles for people, and we'll glue up multiple pieces. And the only tools we have are a giant planer, a really big bandsaw, and a track saw. That's it. And so we're just track sawing all of our cuts. And I'm looking at these joins and I can see the saw marks. And I'm going like, why don't you guys have a joiner? Like, we could do this so easy with the joiner. And they're like, no, man, you just fill it with glue and then just clamp the shit out of it. And I'm like, I don't want to have to use like a torsion bar to break the clamp off the damn thing. But that's just like a different way of doing it. What are the typical materials that violins are usually made out of?
So pretty standard. We use maple for like the back, the sides, and neck, spruce for the top, and people are starting to kind of move away from actual ebony, but generally like the nut, the saddle, the fingerboard are ebony. And yeah, I mean that's really pretty much it. Like I use willow for the blocks because it's really lightweight and it's just kind of like nice to carve out. Some people just use spruce, some more spruce, but that's about it. It's really pretty standard. You can kind of get away with poplar sometimes, but honestly, like once you start moving into different types of wood, it starts affecting kind of like the tone of the instrument enough. Like you want to keep it not most violins, you expect it to be kind of on the brighter side of sounds. Even a darker violin is going to be much brighter than like a guitar or something. So, you don't want to go too crazy because if you do something like a willow back or something on a violin, it might be a little bit strange for some people and harder to sell. But you can get away with that kind of thing on a viola.
Oh.
Violas, there's a lot more like leniency about things in the viola world, which is kind of why I like making them, because the rules, they're all over the place and nothing's really standard aside from like neck measurements and things like that. But the actual building of the instrument, like violists love it when you do something different. So it's kind of fun to take a break from some of the more like strict parameters of making a violin and do some kind of wacky viola thing and like get really good response from it, and then kind of go back to like, okay, now I'm gonna like do something with more rigidity and have a good time kind of following some more rules.
Yeah. Is there a certain type of spruce that is preferred over others, and the same for maple?
So a lot of our spruce and the maple, people prefer to have it imported from Europe, like specifically kind of like near like northern Italy, which is kind of where all the like, original violin makers were theoretically getting their wood from. And that wood is really nice wood. I don't know what it is about the conditions over there, but you can feel the difference between like an American maple and a European maple. And sometimes they can sound a little different too. Like I've used Sitka spruce a few times now, and it feels very different. And it also has a really different kind of a tone than some kind of like European spruce that's kind of a little more buttery and soft. So,
Oh, I see. A really good source that I've found for information on wood is Justin Robertson over at Robertson Violins. He knows everything. And what I learned from him recently, and I was sort of aware of this, and he just throws it out there so nonchalantly. And with great exuberance. It's wonderful. He was telling us at the wood shop last time he stopped by, he was just pointing out like growth rings, and like this is the winter section and this is that, and it's these sort of alpine areas that lend themselves to producing these really wonderful woods. And I was like, oh, duh, like that makes a lot of sense. And it's really like that for a lot of different industries where they're pulling different wood from, in sort of flat lands. You're not going to get the same yield or the same trees because they're not going to necessarily want to grow there. And I thought that was really interesting because I know very little about that stuff. Like I can barely identify a log of something, which is another skill that I'm getting, to build working there, because we cut up logs and stuff, and it's wild. Like, oh, that's what it looks like in tree form. I only see the aftermath. So with the violas, the traditional, I'm guessing, would be maple and spruce once again. You mentioned that ebony was the standard for a while and not so much anymore. So it's kind of a two-part question, maybe three parts. Number one, do you have a recipe that you've settled on that you really like the outcome? Number two, it kind of falls into that, is if that's no, then number two is where we start, which is, do you have a preferred material for violas? Go.
I mean, as far as like recipes go, I always take really thorough notes about what I've done. So, I keep track of like the density of the wood, like the weight that I got when I was done carving it, and like the tones I'm getting, like the tap tones. Also, measurements for certain things. I always draft it out on a piece of paper. So I keep track of things in case, it comes out and I'm just like, wow, that one was really good. I want to make that again. I kind of know what I did. But also right now, I feel like I'm early enough in my career. I had to make this decision last year, really. I had to decide, is it that I'm so early in my career, I should really like stick to just like being really, specific about what I'm making and just always making the same thing and getting like a lot of consistency? Or should I use this time to like go crazy and make weird stuff? And I kind of decided I'd like to go crazy and make weird stuff. So that's what I've been doing. And I've been making, it's not really that weird, but I've just been enjoying trying new models is basically what I'm doing. So, I made a few Stradivari models in school and a Guarneri del Gesù model and, 15.5-inch Gasparo da Salo viola in school. I'm still making those makers, but I'm trying different models by them. So, this violin that I'm working on right now is another Guarneri del Gesù, but it's kind of like a lesser talked about one because it's like a little bit on the smaller side. And I know a couple places that are kind of looking for slightly smaller instruments, like more of like a 7/8 size is what they call it, instead of like 4/4 size. So, it's just a little bit smaller. So I feel like I can find somewhere to sell it without a problem. And I just wanted to try it out because it was cute, it like spoke to me. I looked at the picture and I was like, that's a really cute looking violin. I want to make that one. And I'm remaking my very first violin again, and that one had sounded really good. So I'm excited to try that model again, but this time I'm using American maple and, instead of European maple. So that'll be kind of fun. And my violas, I've been experimenting with the same model, but in different sizes. So I kind of have to redraft it. But basically, I have to extend the viola by, some number of millimeters to make it a 16 or 16 1/4 or 16 1/2. And, that also means moving the F holes around, like lengthening them and things like that. So, so I get to play around with stuff a lot and kind of also experiment with arch shapes and widths and things in that regard. And that's really cool. I really enjoy that sort of thing, just like playing around with different shapes and seeing what feels right and looks right and what does what. I think eventually I'll have a good handle on what everything means so that I can just kind of like whip out exactly what people want. If they say like, I need this kind of sound, I can say, oh, I know from like my experiences making all these things that, if I put this arch shape with this kind of wood and like on this type of model, I can get something like that, and that's kind of what I'm going for. And I'll probably feel that way in like 30 years.
That's a great place to be, as a luthier, right? To have somebody, say like, hey, I'm looking for this sound and know how to get there. I feel like I'm finally there and I finally understand enough of that, like different materials, how to manipulate them, what to look for certain types of like tonal characteristics or behaviors, tonal behaviors within a material. Because we work with organic materials, so if you get you can get a really light, almost porous piece of maple, within a species, within a board, within a log, you can get from one side to the other and it's night and day. One side's like steel and the other side is like balsa wood. Like I've seen it happen. And so to kind of understand that and know where to go, like I could use this maple like to get this softer, sort of more, nuanced sound, less harsh. I could use this piece of wood in place of whatever I might use. Like it's really good to learn those tricks and kind of figure out where you can sub stuff and be more artistic. I found my last question that I forgot, which was, what are you guys using for a stand-in for ebony?
So there are a few ebony alternatives that have come out recently. One is corine, which is basically just a type of plastic. I think it's coming out of Switzerland. It's almost like 3D printed, like a really advanced 3D printing of a fingerboard in this really nice, hardy plastic that, looks fairly convincing, especially from, the audience to the stage. Like no one's going to notice that that's not ebony. And so, that's one. And the nice thing about those is that they're kind of already shaped. So you don't have to do all the like extra shaping that you have to do with like an actual ebony blank. There's also, there's sauna wood, which is another kind of like, it's not a wood composite. I think it's more like a compressed wood. And they do that in a bunch of different styles of wood. And those are kind of cool because you can get like a spruce one or like a maple one. And I think they do have like a black one. I forget what it's actually made out of, but it just looks more like a normal fingerboard. But you can also kind of go crazy and like use kind of a different look if you wanted to. And so there's those, and there's also a Gaia tone, which is a wood composite that really looks a lot like ebony, and it feels a lot like ebony under your fingers. It's kind of difficult to work on, but it's, in theory, like it comes the shape you need it to be, so you shouldn't need to work on it. So that's kind of cool. Really the tricky thing behind all this is that, ebony is just becoming more and more endangered. It's going to start being a problem soon, where people are going to, kind of the same way ivory is, where people are calling you to, have you remove the ivory key tops off their piano so that they can bring it into America, kind of a thing. Like, we're going to have to like start popping off fingerboards and throwing out pegs so that people can bring their violin in, that sort of thing. So it's good to start making those changes now so that this doesn't happen to our customers. And you've just got to find something that looks nice and feels nice to the player, and also is going to hold up under all that work that it's getting. And that's been the trickiest part, but I think they've actually found like some pretty good solutions so far. So I'm pretty excited about those. And I know in the guitar world, at least, I know Gibson has like a big monopoly on all the ebony around. But I think at least, you can have like a rosewood fingerboard or something different, some other kind of like nice wood that's like pretty hard, and you can kind of do that instead. So
Yeah, have you played with any of the rosewoods or rosewood types for your fingerboards and stuff like that?
I haven't, not for violin. It's, it's a little bit like what we were talking about earlier. People, violinists, have like certain expectations about what their instrument should look like a little more often than some other types of musicians. I think a lot of that might come from just like the orchestra setting. You're in a big group. You don't want to be like the one guy with the weird violin or whatever. I mean, sometimes people do, but sometimes, well, a lot of times people don't, they don't want to stick out. So I think maybe that's a little bit where that mentality comes from, whereas guitar is much more of a solo instrument, and I think people don't mind being more noticeable in that sense. But I think people also are starting to appreciate that, ebony itself is a little bit of an issue, and and maybe it is kind of fun to have something a little bit different. So people are getting a little more open to having different kinds of wood on their instrument. And I think more makers are starting to try it out just to see, does this sell? Like, okay, will people buy this if I put rosewood on it or something? So it's probably something I'll look into in the near future, for
Yeah,
sure.
if you find yourself in Albuquerque, we have a few species that I think would be great structure-wise, like with the grain structure.
Hmm.
Once you start to understand grain structure and density, like then you're like, oh, that would be perfect for this situation or that situation. And we definitely have a few things that I would definitely sub out. They're not black like a lot of ebony can be, but they're very striking
Hmm.
and will be just as durable and probably, lending that bright end to things. They'd probably be just as good, just looking at the density, the grain structure, that sort of thing. Yeah, I'd be happy to show you what I have in mind. I forget the names. We got some in recently. I think one of them was a stand-in for like a yellow heart, maybe, or Osage, and it's called Gaibo, and it's like yellow, and the stuff we got in is like really figured, so it's like got all this flame through it. Not like super tight fiddleback flame, but pretty wavy. And then I think some of it had like some bird's eye in it, and just a lot of really cool figure. Some of it was really quartered, but even the real slab cut squirrely pieces, they're just so striking and so solid. They would make a beautiful fingerboard or tailpiece. and recognizing that, I was like, oh wow, that's really cool. We have this other, it's not a rosewood, but it looks like a rosewood. It's called Chechen, if I'm saying that right. It's just Chechen. Um, Very striking looking. It's real like rusty red, with black swirls, very similar to a lot of Brazilian rosewood that I've seen. But the grain structure is a lot more similar to ebony, to me, and to a lot of really similar woods. And like Purple Heart, I would say is very similar, but it's not as dense, and not as consistently dense. And so, like Bloodwood would also be a really good stand-in in that it's usually more like closer to the density of ebony. I find like all those heavily pigmented woods tend to be more dense, and their grain structures tend to be very similar. If they're not in that vein of ebony where it's kind of like crumbly and really tightly packed, they're like this stringy texture, which or like splintery, and so they tend to want to chunk out, and that's not, not what ebony is like to me. So I'll usually stay away from those when I'm trying to kind of get the feel of ebony without ebony involved. But yeah, thank you for sharing about that. So you spent some time in California, and you're in Santa Fe now, and you're making violins and violas. Is there any sort of inspiration you draw from your culture, whether it's familial or just like, nature or anything like that? Like, because a violin is such a thing, right? Like, you think of it, you know exactly what it is. Chances are, even if you see a viola and you're not familiar with this, family of stringed instruments, you're going to think a viola is a violin. So, like, can you speak on that?
I think one of the interesting things I've found so far about violin making is that, like I said earlier, a lot of people, who aren't used to looking at them kind of think they all look the same. And so even describing like, no, this is a Del Jesu versus this is a Stradivarius can be kind of complicated to people. They're like, I don't see how those are different. And you have to like really make them like stare at it and like, look at how it's different. Like, see, this is pointy. This is not pointy. Like, and, and they kind of start to see it. But then even beyond that, there's really, and I think this is true across all Luthierie really, but we're making things by hand, and kind of just in that way, naturally incorporating our own style into it, and our own preferences, whether we're really thinking about it or not. And I think the first time I noticed that was I went to a convention, like a competition/convention in my very first year of violin making school with my instructor and a few other classmates. And I remember he was walking down the competition tables. They have everything out on display until they declare a winner. So you can just kind of go look at everything. And he recognized like the works of his students, even though everything was supposed to be anonymous. Like, he'd be like, oh yeah, this guy made that one. Oh yeah, I recognize, like that kind of thing. And these were all very like similar models of instruments, but he could see like their own individual style just, within that too. And you can see that, like when I look at my classmates' work, I can kind of be like, oh yeah, I think, that's that's
Wow.
Yedidia's or something, and and so yeah, I think I kind of inherently put a lot of, myself into my work just based on aesthetic preferences alone, kind of even. But I think I did really want to make a varnish out of like local pines and stuff. I was like, that would be so cool. Make like a New Mexico violin. I really wanted to do that. But the very first step of varnish making is like cooking down the resins. And it was not something you should do within like 5 blocks of humans. It's like, it's really bad. It's like, it's just like I could smell it like 2 blocks away, and I was like, oh my God, like I had to like run back because I thought I had like 20 minutes or something. So I like went to go check the mail, like came back and had to just turn it all off and like put it all away before somebody like called somebody because it was really bad. So yeah, you gotta like live out in the middle of nowhere to make varnish. So that that never happened, unfortunately. But I would have liked to do something like that just because I think it would be interesting, to see how the woods here are different than like the other kinds of woods. I'm sure, like the pines here have like a completely different texture than anything else that I've worked with. And, even like a maple that's not indigenous to here would still have its own kind of growth just from being in this kind of a climate. So it would be really interesting to make something for here that's just like a whole like New Mexico themed thing. And I think that would be really interesting, but I just haven't been able to do it yet in large part because of that varnish problem. We'll see if I ever get that sorted out.
Yeah, right. It'd be like a camping trip essentially to go make varnish.
Yeah. Like show up with like a gas mask, and that's really kind of what it like needed. It was pretty bad.
Oh
But
man. So you mentioned earlier that you made this decision to be a luthier. Is this something that you're doing full time now?
yeah, so I was doing it full time all last year basically. And then this year we just had kind of like slower sales last year. I think it's my own fault. I raised my prices. So
Oh, God
it
forbid,
really
right?
I know. I was like so proud of myself. I was like, I'm gonna raise my prices. Like my instruments are selling really well. I think it's time. And then I did, and then it like sales just like slowed down to a crawl because it's a whole new price bracket. And I was not thinking about that aspect of it. I maybe should have kept it at the lower price a little bit longer in retrospect until I was a little bit more prepared for that sort of thing. So, lesson learned like a little bit too late.
Yeah.
But for now, I just have like some part-time things that I do just to kind of get some kind of consistent income during the month. And then I am still making as much as I can, which is like 4 days a week or something. I just work as much as I can. And I'm actually doing okay in that regard. I'm not really going any slower than I was last year, so that's good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's so many different types of people working in all sorts of different fields that are attracted to lutherie. And then there's also like, you might see, for instance, I was aware of this builder, this bass maker, since like I started making guitars and he had ads in all of the magazines, and you assume that because you see an ad that this person's successful and his builds are beautiful. And whether he was successful or not, like monetarily, it I learned that. So this was like, he had ads out in the late 80s, early 90s, probably all the way up into present. And this year is the first year he's going to work for himself full time.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, like, so that assumption that just because you take an ad out and you're like, you're well off as a builder, or you're very successful, meaning that you're booked for days, for years. It really put that into perspective. And I think now with all the market saturation and luthierie and everything, how easy it is to learn something now. I think now what really defines a successful luthier to me is, are you enjoying what you're doing?
Mm.
And I feel like I'm finally there. And for a long time, I was just trying to make the ends meet with luthierie, right? And really working a lot, working really hard, kind of burning the candle from both ends. And now I feel like I'm successful. I'm probably doing the least amount of guitar work that I have done in the past. And just before we got on here, I was sending out job applications, and looking for, more part-time work or like different things, trying to get back into different things just to be able to pay the bills and still have fun. And it's the reality for a lot of people. And I just love talking about it because it's a very real part. Like when you get that understanding of somebody that they're not just in their shop working all the time, and that's why they're so good. No, have you ever considered that this person might actually be talented? This person might just actually be good at what they're doing, even though they might only spend a few hours a week in the shop, or a couple days in the shop. Like they're probably just really good at what they do and they love what they do. And, that's what you're picking up on. Like, and yes, everyday people can do this if you want to. If you want to grow those skills, it's like anything else. But yeah, I totally get that. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. I go through this all the time. Sometimes I work for myself full time. Sometimes I work somewhere else. Sometimes, full time. Sometimes it's part time. It's just I'm all over the place, especially since we moved out here. I think if anything, it's more impressive when you see that, wait a minute, you don't spend 1,000 hours a week working on these things and you got that much work done. Oh my God. Oh
I have
wow.
actually found too that like since I've had to start doing other things, my time in the shop is so much more efficient. It's weird. And it's not like I'm rushing through it. Last year, I was trying to just do this full time and I kind of was. But when you're doing that way, like the instrument that you're making becomes your paycheck. And it's hard. Like I really didn't like thinking of it that way. And I didn't want to do that anymore. And that was part of why I was like, I'm just going to get something else going so that I can make some money so that I don't have to worry quite so much about, when this instrument's going to be done. I want it to be done when I'm ready for it to be done. And I found that like doing other stuff is kind of nice because it gives you some time to kind of like plan in your head and you come home and you're just like, okay, now I'm going to sit down, I'm going to carve this out. And like it's all like ready to go in your brain instead of like sitting down and thinking about it for a while and like, oh, maybe I should work on that other thing first or whatever. Like you're ready to go and you do it really quick and it doesn't feel rushed and it comes out good and it's nice and you don't ever feel like burnt out or anything. Like you're excited to sit down and work, and you're not like, oh God, I've got to go work on that thing again tomorrow, which sometimes happens when you have something hard to do. I haven't had to do anything like that in a while, but yeah, it's nice. I think it's good to diversify a little bit.
Yeah, we were just writing an article about burnout, and I have a strange relationship to that word. I feel like, not to make this about me, but I don't really have any give up. And usually when I'm doing something, I'm all in. And a lot of times, like in the past, I would just work until I was sick. And when you have respiratory issues and you're already in bad shape and you decide to work around everything that makes you sick, it's not a good idea. And you top that off with burning the candle from both ends every day, all year. It's a recipe for disaster, but I never stopped. Just kept going, sick or not. And until it got to the point where I had to make some changes. And even now, like I look at, for instance, I'm feeling tired. I have 35 minutes left of shop time today. Let's see if I can blast through as much of this, whatever I'm doing, and get ahead regardless of how I feel. That's kind of my mentality. And like in a separate work situation, I'm their first person there, last person to leave. And my coworkers are saying, you're going to burn out. You're going to burn out. You're going to burn out. You should take some time off. Well, let's look at what I value. I don't care to travel. I like to work. I have like monetary goals. I'm trying to save money for this or that, right? Like all sorts of things. But number one, I don't care to travel or take time off. I enjoy working and I feel out of place when I'm not working, and they didn't take the time to even understand that, or ask about it. It was just like, you're going to burn out. You're going to burn out. When you say burnout, what does that mean to you?
To me. Yeah, that's tricky because I feel like I'm a little bit more like in your boat kind of where like I like working and not every kind of work though. I guess I should distinguish like to me I was talking to somebody this morning and I was telling her like, "Oh yeah, I just like have been working on this when I haven't been working at my other thing." And she was like, "Oh, you're going to be so worn out." And I was like, "Actually like I really find violin making work very relaxing. Like it like helps me think or something. I don't know. It kind of like resets my brain. And so I really enjoy it. And like my dad will be like, "What'd you do this weekend?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I just worked all weekend." And he's like, "Oh no." And I'm like, "No, it was great. I loved it." Like, but I think I have kind of almost burnt myself out like once or twice. But like, yeah, like doing kind of the same thing where I just wasn't stopping. It was especially like at the end of my last year at North Bennet Street School. I just really wanted to finish by a certain date. And I had, two instruments that were, partially done and a few more months to get everything finished before my instructor had to go for the year. And and there were certain things I didn't want to do alone, like without his supervision. So I really wanted to make it to this deadline that I had set for myself. And I was just in school, like working on this instrument till like, I don't know, basically until security kicked me out at like, 10 or 11 every night. Like I come in on weekends and, I just was there all the time. And eventually, I guess, like, I didn't even know it was possible, but you can just get mono for like no reason, basically. So that's kind of what happened is like I got really sick. Like, I just started feeling bad, and then I just couldn't do anything for like 2 weeks because I just like took it too far. If I stood up too long, I'd like fall over. So I had to like
Yeah.
sit a lot and take a lot of breaks and that was kind of rough. Like that was like, okay, like I need to learn where to stop. And I think I've got like a good handle on that now. I have a kid and I like have to be able to do things for him too. So like I've really learned to understand like when I'm getting close to a point where I'm not going to be able to uphold what I need to do, like whether it's focusing enough on what I'm making to do a good job, or whether it's like being able to like pick up my son and carry him so I don't throw out my back, or like there's all kinds of things that are like that I have to keep in mind so that I don't push myself so far that I can't do any of it. And to me, that's really, it's on my mind a lot. And I have to monitor it a lot because I really am like spread very thin these days. But I think I've got a good handle on it. I think, like, in general, when people are talking about burning out, a lot of times it has to do with like hating your work.
Very on point.
And
Yes.
so I think like that's another thing that I really spent a lot of time on last year also was kind of getting like my mental health stuff in order because I was just having a hard time with a lot of different things, and one of those things too was like being really disappointed in myself and my work. And even though people liked it, it was like never good enough. And I think a lot of makers across all aspects of luthiery feel that way, where they make something and they're just like, this isn't what I wanted. And I think learning how to work with myself so that I'm getting what I want most of the time, but also learning to accept that, some things just don't always work out like the way that you intended, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Like learning to deal with that kind of stuff has helped with that kind of a feeling of like not wanting to come into work because you don't want to like look at this thing that you've been working on and it's just like disappointing or whatever. I think that's a lot of what people are talking about when they're burnt out on their work.
Yeah, you hit on some really good points, and thank you for sharing. I was just talking to this guy earlier, and I was sharing with him about how the last year and up until now, so a little over a year now, I've been seeing a therapist once a week. It's helped me get a handle on a lot of the negative speech and stuff that can go on in your head. And, and I didn't realize it was so problematic until, started going over it in therapy. And I was like, oh, shit. Here I was thinking that I was this fairly confident person. And it turns out that I'm quite the opposite. And, I didn't realize that I was getting depressed when I was getting really bitchy about things. I didn't realize that I was, getting depressed and having feelings about stuff. And, for me, it was just like, oh, my back hurts today. Oh, well, the show's got to go on. And, the next thing you know, oh, shit, I can't move. How's the show going to go on, And I think the reason why I bring this up is, what often happens is we push way too hard through everything and then we end up fucked eventually. And it doesn't have to be like that. And sometimes we're just learning the hard way, through experience. But a lot of times, I like to tell people, like, pay attention to things. If you're not feeling good, take it easy, take a step back. It's okay. I'm not going to make fun of you. If anybody's making fun of you, then, reconsider what they mean to you, because that's not really a healthy relationship. And I feel like it's such an important thing. Like, mental health is such a big game because you can be like unbreakable in that, like, I love everything that I'm doing, right? But at the end of the day, you still need to rest. And, like, is your sleep quality good? Uh, these are things like I'll get together with luthiers. I'm like, how's your sleep? Are you sleeping good? You got bags under your eyes, like, are you okay? How you feeling? I really appreciate you sharing about that. Where do you see yourself, or where would you like to be in 2 years?
In 2 years, it's hard to say. I think I know where I'd ultimately like to be. I'm trying to think realistically what that would mean 2 years from now. I think probably just being able to consistently make 6 instruments a year would probably be really ideal, as a 2-year goal kind of a thing. Like if I can just always make sure that I've got this good timeline, these things are getting done and I'm getting these out so that I can actually get a good income from instrument making. I think that would be nice. I think that's a step in the right direction to where I want to be in the end.
So you are on Instagram and Facebook, is that correct?
Yeah. The Instagram and the Facebook are pretty similar. I also have a new Patreon that I just made, which has some just really strange stuff right now because I don't have I don't have members yet. I just started it a week ago or something. And so I was kind of like, well, I'll just post stuff. And then when I get enough people, they can kind of tell me the kinds of things they like. But it's kind of funny because it's just how would you describe that? Like on Instagram, everything kind of has to be a little bit of a show. You have to take some time, make sure this looks just right. And because you've got one shot to kind of get everyone's attention. And the Patreon's a little bit more genuine, I feel like.
Oh, okay.
It's just a lot of me just talking about my process and it clearly just rolled out of bed. I'm I would really like this Patreon if it was, something I was subscribing to, but I don't know if that's for other people, but we'll see.
That's funny. Your content on Instagram is very well done. Good job with that. I really enjoy the quality of your pictures, how you get these close-up shots. We were actually sitting down at the wood shop, just looking at the videos, going, "Wow, this is so cool." Thank you for taking the time to do the podcast. I really appreciated talking with you. We're just directing everyone to our website because we've got all your links along with the little bio and all of that stuff. But thank you once again. Did you have any last thing that you wanted to share before we sign off here?
Not really, just, thanks for inviting me to this, and thanks for having me on the podcast. And I'm looking forward to the actual show in June. Yeah. So I'm excited. It'll be fun.
Cool. Well, you have a great rest of your day. I'll catch you later.
Thanks. Yeah. See ya.
All right. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Julia Felix of Felix Violins. I very much enjoyed chatting with her. I look forward to seeing her work at the next HDLI, which will be Sunday, June 2nd, here in Albuquerque at Rio Bravo Brewing. Once again, we'll go ahead and plug all the socials. You can find us at High Desert Luthiery on Instagram. If you want to catch more podcasts, you can visit our YouTube channel, High Desert Luthiery Podcast. While you're visiting both of those, please do like, subscribe, share, hit all the good buttons to help us out. Show us some love. We'd greatly appreciate it. And to learn more about the event, as well as all of our vendors, the musicians involved, and everyone helping us put the High Desert Luthiery Invitational together, you can visit our website, highdesertluthiery.com. I am Perry from Unga Guitars, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.